So Tyler, tonight we're obviously here with Tyler Ferrell, founder and creator of Golf Smart Academy, and our leading golf expert, our mad scientist to playing better golf. And tonight, this webinar is on power. And take it away, Tyler.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks everyone for getting on here. As he mentioned, I'm hoping to do a number of these in the future, so I'll ask again at the end, but if you have any topics that you'd like to have covered, or if you have any questions or comments about this particular presentation, please let me know. I will be taking questions kind of at the end, so if you want to put them in the chat, that's fine. But if I don't get to them right away, understand that we're going to go through a quick little PowerPoint, and then we're going to do some case studies. So we're going to actually look at some video and do some analysis there. So without further ado, let's get into power and essentially asking or answering one of the big questions, which is, why did the golf ball go as far as it did? So there's three main questions to kind of playing golf and understanding feedback. One is, why did the ball start there? Two is, why did the ball curve the way it did? And then three, why did the ball go that far? This presentation is all about answering that last question. So there's three main factors when it comes to why did the ball go that far. The first one is ball speed, so how fast that ball is moving when it leaves the club face. The second would be spin rate, and the third would be launch angle. Now in club fitting, for really decades, they've used charts that look similar to what I have in the presentation right here, which is basically, if you take any given ball speed, then you can predict how far the ball is going to go based on the spin rate and the launch angle. So because the underlying, or the most important one, or the one that they kind of base that on, is ball speed, we're going to start there. So ball speed is really a product of two key factors. One is club head speed, and two is smash factor. So club head speed, we're going to get into a bunch of some of the body movements and some of the science behind how we create speed with the club head. But smash factor is one of the critical ones. So smash factor is essentially looking at the centeredness of the hit, or how close did you hit the ball in the sweet spot. So the typical example that they'll give is, if you have a club head speed of 100 miles per hour, and if you had almost a perfect smash factor of 1.5, that would cause the ball speed to be 150 miles per hour. So if you have a smash factor down in the 1.3s, it means that you're hitting it well off of the sweet spot, and we're going to get speed, or we're going to get distance from hitting it more in the center than we are from maximizing your club head speed. On the opposite, if you have a very good smash factor, the only way that you're going to be able to get more distance is by either improving your launch, improving your spin rate, or getting that club head speed up. And all of those are definitely possible. So when we look at the body and how it creates this club head speed, there's two major things that I'm looking at when I'm looking at 3D. One is going to be sequencing, which sequencing could really be broken down into subcategories, but sequencing is going to be the timing of when you're using specific parts of your body, but you could also include the speed in sequencing. And then the second piece is going to be the range of motion. So just looking at the sequencing and the speed doesn't necessarily show you how much distance you're actually covering. And that's a big factor for when it comes to creating speed. There was an article in 2008 that the gentleman on the screen, his name is Jason Misch, and myself, when we both worked at Club Golf, Jason worked with this reporter, and I kind of threw in my 2 cents, and through doing some exercises, we were able to get him to use his lower body a little bit more effectively. And by using his lower body more effectively, he was able to improve his club head speed from 100 miles per hour to 110 miles per hour. And it was the biggest jump of all the technologies that this reporter tried to use in order to search for that elusive 300-yard drive. Basically, we'll get into why this is so important, but sequencing of moving the lower body first, then the trunk, then the shoulders, then the arms is going to be the best way to create the greatest amount of club head speed. In addition, it does some really good things for your path and launch angle. But let's focus on just that, the body component, or how does using the body in the right way create more speed? Well, I like to use the example of, let's just say we had a weightlifting competition. And in this weightlifting competition, the only rule is lift as much weight as you can. So most people would choose a total body lift. They would choose squats, or they would choose deadlifts or something like that, because the more muscles that you use is basically gives you greater force producing potential. So if you have a really poor squat form, that's okay, but for your body, you're going to be able to create as much speed as you can. What happens when your sequencing is off and when you start the downswing with more of an aggressive movement of your shoulders and your upper body is it forces your rib cage to essentially stabilize instead of producing speed. The other analogy that I like is, imagine that you had a car on just in neutral in a parking lot, and you had two people to push it to go get gas. One is a kind of a big strong guy, and the other guy is kind of a scrawny weak guy. Well, there's two different ways you could do it. You could either have the scrawny kid push first and then the big strong guy, but if you did that, essentially the scrawny kid wouldn't be able to get the car moving. So when the big strong guy got involved, essentially he'd be doing all the work. The second option is the big strong guy, the body guy. He gets the car moving, and then the scrawny weak guy is actually able to help apply more force because you've overcome inertia. So when you swing with your whole body, especially your lower body, your hips and your core, that's essentially like pushing with your big muscles or using a squat technique instead of if you push with just your arms, or if your sequencing is off. It's kind of like going into this weightlifting competition and doing a curl, or the gentleman pushing the car having the weak guy go first. It ultimately doesn't really create nearly as much speed. So the second piece that we're going to talk about is this range of motion. So in the golf swing, there's a lot of things that we can look at, and we're going to break down the body and look at the different pieces that go into creating range of motion. But essentially, what we're looking at here is two examples that we'll look at later, Bubba Watson and Corey Pavin. And if we just look at displacement, or the distance that the grip is away from the golf ball, you'll see that a gentleman like Bubba Watson is going to move the golf club over a greater distance than someone like Corey Pavin. That greater distance is going to give him more distance to apply force, so he can apply kind of a somewhat gradual force, but basically he doesn't have to be quite as explosive and potentially damaging on his body, so it works out for repeatability. So when you have the combination of full displacement like Bubba Watson and good sequencing, that's when you typically have the golfers who hit the ball the furthest, and we'll get into a lot of that when we get into the case studies. So when we look at this displacement and range of motion, we're going to look at the big pieces of the body. So when it comes to the body, we can use full hip rotation, we can use full spine rotation, side bend, and even some extension in the backswing. We can use the trail wrist in flexion and extension pretty much as we can, and we can use the lead wrist in supination pretty much as we can. The shoulders are going to lift, and the trail arm is going to externally rotate. If you do all those pieces kind of as much as you can, that's going to move the club and the grip as far away from the golf ball as you can, while still keeping yourself in position to then apply force on the downswing. So typically what happens is, if a golfer hits the ball farther from shortening their swing, it's usually that it improved their sequencing or their centeredness of contact, getting back to that smash factor. But if you can create the same sequencing from a larger motion, you have a greater potential for power. So there are some big barriers to creating this ball speed or club head speed. From a technical point of view, there's two major ones that we're going to see related to the grip. One would be if the grip is in the palm, essentially it limits how much speed you can get from your arms to your wrist. And so what ends up happening is your whole arm moves as a block instead of kind of two segments in a chain, and it doesn't create nearly as much speed. The other one is if the club face is in an open position. And the reason that that becomes so problematic is if the club head is if the club face is in an open position during the downswing, essentially it's going to limit the amount of body rotation you can have through the shot. So it forces you to use some of those big muscles that could create speed to stabilize, or it will force them to create speed in such a way that affects your angle of attack, which is going to affect that launch angle spin characteristic. So a common example would be if you have the club face open, you're going to typically stop your body from rotating and fully extend those arms. Now, if you did that and had good side bend, you would hit the ball fat. So it forces you to kind of lunge a little bit, which is another power leak. So there's a whole cascade of events that can happen if you have either a poor grip or a grip in the palm, which is why we have 2 or 3 videos to go over in great detail what you need to do there. Also, from the technical point of view, would be ball position. So if the ball is too far back in your stance, essentially what that's going to do is if you did everything else correctly, your spin and your launch would be way off. So it forces you to use your body in not as effective a way. Essentially, if we got back to that weightlifting example, it'd be probably like picking a bench press instead of your squat. So it's not you can still have reasonable power production, but it limits how much you're going to be able to get from that lower body because of what it would do to your angle of attack if you did. And then the last piece, which we'll cover more in this presentation, is missing the sweet spot. So if you're using your body as a primary source for controlling the path of the sweet spot and not doing a good enough job with controlling the path with the arm so that the body can create more speed, that's going to be a big power leak as well. So from a physical standpoint, you'll see that there's 3 major criteria for creating speed. 1 would be flexibility, 2 would be stability, and 3 would be power. Now you'll see on there that strength isn't really limited or strength isn't mentioned because it tends to be a much lower priority when it comes to something like golf or throwing, mostly because the implement is so light and you have such little time to apply force to it. You need more power than you need more strength. I always use the example of professional athletes because I've worked with a handful, and when you work with ex-professional athletes, you see a lot of what they did in their sport in their golf swing. And if strength was an indicator of how far they would hit the ball, then when you work with linemen who are the strongest football players, they would hit the ball some of the greatest distances, but because they're limited in some of their shoulder flexibility, their trunk, their hips are usually pretty good, but they're limited in these other flexibility components, which prevents them from maximizing anything. So typically, the guys who hit the ball the furthest are going to have full range of motion, great stability, and explosive power. I used to work with a long drive guy who could not bench and didn't want to, but could not bench press his body weight. But he had an explosive vertical jump. He could throw a medicine ball extreme distances. He had lots of power, lots of flexibility, and that's how he was able to compete. So from a physical standpoint, there's lots of good stuff that we can do with the body. From a club fitting, we're going to take your club head speed, and then there's those 2 major components. Do you have too much spin? Do you have too little launch? And then that last one that's kind of a hybrid of club fitting and technical is, are you missing the sweet spot? Now, the reason it's a hybrid is if the shaft doesn't fit your swing, or if the lie angle is way off, then you're going to sacrifice some of your body movements in order to get that sweet spot, trying to get closer to a golf ball. But usually it's going to cause you to do movements that limit your what we call 3D flat spot, or one of these big predictors of consistency. So club fitting can absolutely affect this ball speed, but the biggest ones that I'm going to look at are going to be technical and physical, at least initially. So let's assume that we're doing everything right and we're getting really good club head speed. How do we turn that club head speed into ball speed? So if we come back to this chart that talks about the important characteristics of spin and launch, and then we're going to throw in that third piece of center face contact. And that one's so important that we're going to cover it first. So solid contact or smash factor can have a huge impact on distance. If this is from Wishon Golf, who's pretty good with sharing lots of information. So if you miss the sweet spot, the numbers that he promotes are essentially a ½ inch from the sweet spot, you're going to lose 5% of total distance, or 1 inch from the sweet spot, you're going to lose 10% of total distance. So you can see these two face examples. The one on the left is probably a 1/4 inch. The one on the right is probably pretty close to that, 3/4, maybe even an inch. So as an example, if your speed potential is to hit the ball 250 yards, if you hit the ball dead in the center, then if you're a ½ inch off, that could create a distance of 237. And if you're off by an inch, that could be a distance loss of 25 yards, or a total distance of 225. So to make up that distance in creating more club head speed would be a lot harder than if all we did was get you to hit the ball more in the sweet spot. Now that's looking at any energy transfer. It's not looking at the actual loft and launch, because those are two of the other key characteristics of this distance. So what you want to understand is that it can actually be more than what those numbers are showing because of roll and bulge, specifically with the driver and the fairway woods and hybrids. So for drivers, they're typically going to have a curve in both directions of about a 10-inch, 11-inch circle, something like this. So you can see that the club face basically would fit right on a circle, and that actually helps straighten out mishits. But what you can also see is that if the loft on the club says 10 degrees, there's a decent chance that that 10 degrees is right in the middle of the club. It's not always, but there's a decent chance that that's right in the middle of the club. Well, just because of this curve of the face, if you were to hit it an inch high on the center, that would change. If it was an 11-degree radius, that would change the loft by 5.2 degrees. If you hit it an inch low, that would also change it by 5.2 degrees. So instead of having a 10-degree driver, you could be hitting a 15-degree, which is essentially your 3-wood, or a 5-degree, depending on where you're making contact vertically on the face. So it's critical to use some feedback and just kind of dial in hitting the ball close to the sweet spot. And there are big movements that contribute to it, but you can also use simple little setup changes for day-to-day getting you closer to the sweet spot. Like when you're warming up, if you find yourself hitting the ball more on the toe, you have two options. You could either work on swing things that have helped you get off the toe in the past, or you could essentially move a little bit closer or change the ball position by moving it slightly back, slightly forward, whatever helps balance your swing pattern. But when I'm looking at solid contact, typically I'm going to look at impact position, and then I'm going to look at what the path of the club, both the grip and the club head, are doing, and they're going to be influenced largely by this transition and the release. And our goal, as demonstrated on this little gears avatar, is to create this little flat spot in the grip, which helps give us a little bit bigger margin for error. That's part of the reason why we teach the transition and the release the way that we do, because they're the kind of the tour-proven methods for helping maximize your probability of hitting that sweet spot. So if we look at the other two factors, we had launch and spin. Now, spin we can get a little bit kind of nerdy and sciencey if we want to get into, but essentially the difference between where the face is pointing and the path of the club, in terms of loft to angle of attack, is going to give us essentially how much spin we're actually creating. The important thing to know is not necessarily where that spin is being created, but our goal is to minimize the spin if we have a high club head speed. If you have a low club head speed, and what we'll see in some of these later TrackMan fitting charts, is that more speed can actually help. So if we were looking at these as kind of different ways that the ball can fly, if you have a lower club head speed, then having loft on the club can help keep the ball in the air, which maximizes your distance. If you have a high enough club head speed, though, there's this kind of magic window where we're trying to get the right height with the right spin to maximize your club head speed. For the most part, that implies that we're going to try to have a flat or a positive angle of attack, which we'll talk about here in a second when we get into the path section. So I love science and research and studies, and there was an article written in 2008 that TrackMan did, basically showing where it said gain 42 yards now, and I've used it in a number of marketing pieces because it's easy to see how impactful changing the path of your swing can be for total distance. People are often shocked when I tell them during an evaluation that, watch, but in 3 months you're going to be hitting the ball 50 yards further. And it always sounds like an outrageous claim, but it's nice to have a lot of the science to back it up. So basically this article, what it showed was that depending on whether you had a path coming from the inside out, as demonstrated right here, or an outside in, that was going to affect how much ball speed you were able to create, or how much distance you were able to get from any given club head speed. So in this particular article, they took a 95 mile per hour club head speed, and they used a 9-degree outside in, a 6-degree outside in, a 3-degree outside in, and then dead on plane, 3 degrees inside out, 6 degrees inside out, 9 degrees inside out. And if you look at these summary numbers, this is total distance. So essentially, if you're 9 degrees inside out to 0 degrees inside out, you are hitting the ball right around 244. Well, as you got further and further outside in, you can see at only 3 degrees outside in, which is not very much at all, you lost 11 yards. If you go all the way to 9 degrees outside in, which is not unreasonable, that was a loss of 42 yards. And the reason you lost that much distance was because of the angle of attack. When the path got so outside to in, you typically had a really low launch, higher spin, and you lost a lot of distance. Well, so this angle of attack is the most important piece of this path for when we're looking at distance. Well, here's some numbers that are just kind of the known standards for the last few years, as they've been doing this TrackMan kind of research either on tours or on the long drive circuit. The typical average for a long drive is about 5 degrees up. LPGA is 3 degrees up, and PGA Tour is 1 degree down. Now, I have a feeling that over the next decade or so, we're going to have more and more of these PGA Tour guys getting into the +2, +3 category, the way that Rory McIlroy has kind of done this past summer, because he's shown that you can pretty much be as accurate, if not more so, if you hit up the right way, compared to what a lot of pros have been more or less taught to do over the last 20 years. At least that's my opinion. Because distance plays such a huge role and gives such a big advantage, I'm almost always trying to get my golfers to hit slightly up on the ball. The problem is, we know with an iron we want to hit down on it, whether it's 4 degrees or something like that. So now there's some significant changes that we have to make in order to create this new driver swing where we're going to hit 3 degrees up on it. I think that you can absolutely do it relatively easily with proper training. And we talk a good bit about the differences between this ideal iron and ideal driver swing. But for the purpose of maximizing your club head speed, I'm going to show you how important getting this positive angle of attack is. So here's a quick little chart from TrackMan that shows different club head speeds. Remember, that's the thing that we always start with. And then just creating different angles of attack, which create different launch characteristics. What does that do to total distance? So if we take, say, an 80 mile per hour club head speed, we can see the difference between hitting 5 degrees up or 5 degrees down or neutral. So with relatively similar club head speeds, you can see that hitting slightly up on the ball could be as much as 20 yards in carry, or 23 or 21 yards in total distance. Now, in one of those the rich get richer scenarios, let's take a look at some of these higher clubhead speeds. So the top guys on tour can be up around, high teens, up around 120. Well, for someone hitting 5 degrees down and changing to 5 degrees up, the total distance gain can be as much as 45 yards just based on this, how the launch angle changes and how the spin numbers come down. But recognize that if I back up for a second, if you have one of the lower clubhead speeds, having a little bit more spin can be helpful for you creating loft. But if we get into those average distances, if you're trying to hit the ball further, we want to get that positive angle of attack regardless of what we're going to do with the spin. So from a practical example, here's what a typical scenario can look like. If you have someone who has an upper body dominant swing where the upper body is kind of spinning and they're going more with the arms and not using the lower body, but they're able to create 100 mile per hour clubhead speed. Well, if we were to take that 100 mile an hour clubhead speed and just give them the perfect angle of attack, which would be hard to do with that sequencing, but bear with me, that would produce a distance of 272. And now, if we were to go to 5 degrees down and basically give them an iron swing, they lose essentially 30 yards. So they're down to 244. Now, if you also took missing the club or missing the center of the club, which would be very easy to do, now we could be down as far as 220. So some of the guys who I've worked with who are chronically hitting on the toe and hitting down don't realize how big these ball speed gains could be just from getting a proper angle of attack and from getting the golf ball hit in the center of the club. But in this particular example, it could be 52 yards with no change in clubhead speed. So we're going to take a look at some examples that I've pulled up, and then I'll be happy to handle any questions that you might have about anything that I've presented so far, or as we go through some of the video analysis. Let me just pull up and see if there's any chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to send, type a public chat or private, and I'll get to it as they come through. Okay, so we've got a couple examples right here. First one I'm going to pull up is going to be Tiger Woods, and we're going to take a look at what this power producing swing actually looks like. So when we have proper displacement, when we have proper sequencing, that gives us the recipe for creating speed. So I'm going to take Tiger up to the top of his swing, and then basically as we start down, to see how the lower body is getting involved, we're going to look at when the lower body is essentially parallel to the target line. I've used this a number of times, and it's pretty highly correlated with 3D in terms of the lower body initiating the downswing and where the peak is happening. So if we bring Tiger to where his, so right about there is close to where his hips were to start. So there you can see setup. We can see a little bit of his left thigh. If we take it to about that same point in the downswing, it would be right around there, right around when the upper arm there, the humerus, is parallel to the ground. Now here's Bubba Watson, who we used earlier in the PowerPoint, and you'll see his hips get square right about there, or actually before his left arm is parallel to the ground. So this is a common thing that we'll see for longer drivers of the golf ball. They're going to cover a fair amount of movement in the backswing, so they're going to have full displacement, but then they're going to use this sequencing and this movement of the lower body to initiate and create speed. So we'll look at a few of the other guys who kind of led the tour in distance last year, and then we'll look at some of the guys who struggled a little bit or who were lower in the PGA Tour statistics for clubhead speed and distance. So on the left, we've got Dustin Johnson, who I believe was in the top 10, maybe top 15. But we'll see that similar pattern where basically there his thighs are parallel to the ground or parallel to the target line, and you can see that left arm is just approaching parallel. Now we've got Gary Woodland, who was also highly ranked in terms of club head speed last year. Let's see if we can. We'll see if we can get him a little bit more centered. So right between those two frames is where his lower body is getting parallel. And you can see that's again right about when that left arm is parallel to the ground. So those are some examples of the long guys as far as the PGA Tour. But the really long guys are the ones on the long drive circuit. So here's Jamie Sedlowski, who's one of those freaks in terms of hitting the ball, 400 yards plus, and you'll see his thighs get parallel, and that lead arm is well above parallel. The club's still, past parallel. So essentially, he's covering a great amount of space, and he's using that lower body in proper sequencing to kind of slingshot the club head. So now let's take a look at some examples of the guys who struggled a little bit. So Brian Gay was near the bottom of the list in terms of club head speed. So if we take him up to the top of the swing, we can see there's not going to be as much displacement. So he didn't get nearly as much height, mostly from the rib cage, a little bit from the shoulders. But now if we come down, you can see that, yes, the lower body initiated the swing, but you can see that it doesn't get to parallel until his hands are about belt buckle height instead of chest height, or the arms are further down than that lead arm parallel that we were seeing with a lot of these long hitters. This is going to be a common theme that we're going to see with a lot of these shorter hitters. And it's I'll show you some amateur examples where it's relatively common as well. This can be great for short game because the short game sequencing, we want the lower body and the upper body to kind of match themselves and work together. But if we're talking about creating power and creating speed, it's definitely not the most ideal way. So now here we have Corey Pavin, who limits his hip rotation, limits his trunk rotation, doesn't have a ton of arm height. So he doesn't have nearly as much displacement or distance to apply force. And then as we come down, let's let my computer catch up. So as we come down, we can see that he gets his thighs parallel to that target line when the hands are just below. So even a little bit lower than Brian Gay. So that combination of minimal displacement and poor sequencing puts him in the recipe or the cookbook for this is how, if I was going to hit the ball short, this is what I would want to do. Here's another relatively short hitter of the golf ball, straight driver of the golf ball. It's not the best camera angle, but this is Jeff Maggart. So let's see if we can get him back to where those thighs are roughly parallel to the ground. So it's right about there, which you can clearly see that the left arm is at least below. We can't see quite how much, but you can see that the left arm is below. So hopefully you're starting to see this pattern of sequencing and how it relates to club head speed. Now I want to use one example of someone who has decent sequencing, and while he's lower than kind of tour average, he's not at the bottom of the list of in terms of club head speed. But what you'll see is that if we go up to the top of Jim Furyk's swing, you can see, which is right about here, you can see that there's not very much displacement. So he didn't rotate his lower body, he didn't rotate his rib cage. Most of the movement happened here in his shoulders. Now, you'll see that he does a good job. I've seen his kinematic sequence. It's pretty good. He's done a good job of starting that lower body. And then, the trunk tends to follow. So he has that sequencing, but because he's not covering nearly as much space, it doesn't matter that he's using it in a pretty efficient way. He's just not hitting it nearly as far as some of the longer hitters. Now, I want to show a few amateur examples, so some of my students, so that you can kind of visualize how this looks in a kind of non-Tour Pro proven environment. This gentleman, you'll see, is a very new golfer, but he was a collegiate pitcher. So he knows how to create speed, and as he says, he can hit lots of par 5s and 2 if he can find the fairway. So you'll see that his lower body gets to that kind of tour sequence parallel position right about when that left arm is parallel to the ground. Now, his wrist and club face are in an almost unusable position, and so he had to use a lot of body movements to try to help and square the face. But he's got that recipe for power, and so if we work a little bit more on this path and angle of attack, what we were able to do was to get him to what he was comfortable with a pretty good repeatability with his golf swing. Now, I've got two more examples down here. This is a gentleman who, and both of these two gentlemen are a little bit older, but they came to me specifically looking for distance. So they had basically been told that they had taken some lessons, and they had basically been told that the only way they were going to hit the ball further was with working out, and we were able to overcome that. Now, some of them take time, but let's take a look at what that looks like. So these are both reasonable golfers, mid-level handicap. So the golfer on the left, you'll see that lower body reach its parallel position kind of right about there. Down in that Corey Pavin zone, a little bit lower than Brian Gay. Now, he's going to have a pretty dramatic improvement that we're gonna see when we look at the post view. But let's take a look at the gentleman over on the right for what can happen in a short amount of time. So his thighs get back to roughly square when he's making contact with the golf ball. Now he starts with them in a little bit closed position, but they get relatively back to the same position right about when he's making contact with the golf ball. I'll leave the gentleman on the left up here, and we'll bring up his after swing. Now, to be fair, this was after about a season of work, so he had been working on this for almost a year. And what you'll see, if you remember, he got to parallel when the club was, or when the hands were about belt level. What you'll see here is he gets to parallel significantly early. So that change for him resulted in about 35, 40 yards on his good hits. Now, he has some contact issues, and so when he's freaking out because he's lost distance, it's mostly because he's losing the club face. But he's done a much better job of getting the sequencing. I will caution that most people will, watch this presentation and think that, well, if I just try to get my lower body open, I try to get my lower body square, I try to lead with my lower body. What I'd like to caution is that oftentimes the reason that you don't get open the way that we're trying to teach is that because the club face and the path are not in the proper order. And so if you were to rotate harder, it would cause you to either shank the ball or toe the ball, or potentially top the ball. So if that happens, if you start trying to rotate your body and the ball's going right, or you're topping it, or you're shanking it, please check out the transition section to see what the club face needs to be doing, so that you can then add, like, you might have to put in club face awareness in transition before you'll be able to put in the hip speed, which is pretty much what we did with this golfer. So now let me bring up that last little case study. So now this gentleman, essentially this is 1 week later. So we're still working on getting a little bit club face or better club face awareness, but if just as a reminder, when we take him down, so his thighs get parallel pretty much after impact, or we take it down right about there. So we'll go a few frames past that. So now, if we take the next week, this was just after he'd finished his warm-up, and I got a couple swings of him, you'll see that his thighs get parallel right about there. So now we moved it back essentially a foot. That foot was on his good drives, he said, resulted in about 15 to 20 yards further in 1 week, just from getting a little bit more activity from the lower body and complementing it with a few club face things. But I use this as the last example so that you can see it's not that you need to get all the way to where Tiger or Dustin Johnson is, but if you can improve your sequencing even a small amount, it can have big effects on the launch angle, it can have big effects on your spin rate, and it can help you get a little bit more club head speed. So essentially, I wanted to leave the last 15 minutes or so for questions. So if you want to type in any specific questions, whether it's case studies, questions about how your particular swing, I'm happy to answer those things. While you're typing them, I'll bring up a few more examples to show that it's not necessarily age dependent and it's not necessarily gender dependent. So we can use a couple guys from the senior tour. The swing that I had of Corey Pavin was from the senior tour, but here's a guy, Fred Couples, who's still able to compete and hit the ball far enough that he could compete on the regular tour. You'll see he's got that fair amount of displacement going on. Lower body's rotated, good arm height, and you'll see that he gets his hips parallel right about when that lead arm is parallel to the ground as well. You can look at Lexi Thompson as an example of someone on the LPGA who hits the ball a pretty long way for her size, and you'll see that some of the females and some of the juniors will be almost excessive. So you'll see that she gets her thighs parallel right about there where that lead arm and the chest is still well closed. So she's clearly rotating and initiating that downswing with the lower body. Part of the reason why she hits the ball as far as she does. So I have a question about Fred Couples' back. So Fred Couples has I've seen his 3D, and he does a really excessive movement with his lower back of basically arching his back as he initiates the movement. So the thing that Fred does that's kind of unique, because there's a lot of people who arch their lower back, but typically what they'll do is they will stand up with their upper body and it'll mess up their sequencing. Fred is able to basically rotate his lower body, get his back in in a position where he's using more of the ligaments and the joints of his lower back to transfer energy. He's doing kind of a back extension as he's rotating, as opposed to using his abs and his obliques. So the thing that's unique about Fred in the way that, or at least the way that I look at it, is he's using his back as the transfer, the engine to transfer speed from his legs to his trunk, but he's doing it without standing up. And so as a result of him not standing up, his sequencing is actually pretty good, and he's still able to create speed. The problem has been the wear and tear that movement creates. So if you hang on, if you send me a private message, I'll send you a video that I did about the 4 different movements that the core can make, and you'll understand what Fred's doing a little bit better. Okay, I don't see any other questions, so if I'll leave this open and kind of just talk and show a few more examples to give um, opportunity if you have it for right now. Otherwise, I will pretty much cut this short. You know exactly what it takes to produce club head speed, what it takes to turn that club head speed into ball speed. And we've got a whole section on distance in our site that you can check out to kind of figure out what would be the most direct way for you to work on it if distance is your primary concern. All right, I've got a good question. So I see that some players, Johnson, Thompson, have a flatter left arm in the halfway down position. Others are more upright. How much speed, if any, does that affect on ball club head speed? That's a great question. I look at it. There's a couple components. So from the ball speed, club head speed, they're both going to be able to use the lat. So the lat is stretched when either the arm is brought across your body or when it's raised vertically. You can imagine doing a lat pull down or like a cable cross. Those both are going to work your lats. The problem is when it gets very flat, a la Lexi Thompson, typically they're going to have to do something different with their spine, or they'll steepen up their arm path later on. So if we were to look at Lexi on the way down, her big stall move causes those arms to that right arm to internally rotate, which basically steepens it back up for that overly flat arm path early on. Where Freddie, he's done a good job of doing the motorcycle move. He's got his lower body leading. His trunk is in a good position. Now all he has to do is continue rotating and extend those arms, and the club face is essentially already squared. Lexi has to do a much bigger roll using her body to get that right arm to re-steepen out the path. So I don't think it's necessarily going to limit them in terms of club head speed. Until I see something on the contrary, I'm gonna go with that answer. But it's definitely going to have an effect on the centeredness of contact and how they control the path. So good question. I have a question about what role, if any, does parametric acceleration play in distance, which is a great question. That's kind of a hot topic. So parametric acceleration is essentially when you're rotating something around in a circle. We'll see how well I can use paint on here. So if you have something that's kind of going around in a circle like so, the way to get it to move the fastest around the circle is not to pull it in the direction that the arrows are going, but to actually pull it in the direction towards the center. I have a video on head cover swings where basically it helps you feel what that's like, where you're pulling in towards the center and it causes the club to accelerate. So Miro was the guy who wrote the first paper, at least that I read, about this parametric acceleration. And what he specifically said was, in the conclusion, he talks about how it's unlikely that parametric acceleration is happening from the arms, and that it's largely going to be the left shoulder and more, if we take that a step further, the rib cage and its effect on the left shoulder that's going to cause this pull in towards the center. So what we see on all of these I pulled up were down the line. But what we see from a face-on swing, so I'll grab someone, is some of the movements that will produce this parametric acceleration. So they've written about it as basically a what I would consider a firm left side or a stable left side. But if I were to, but what you can see is that the movement of the upper body, here we go, got everything out of my way. So basically there's going to be this weight shift, and if I had a sensor right here, what you would see is during that early part of transition, the upper body would be going towards the target. And then during the second part right there, so I'll do that a little slower, but you got the first part of transition until he's about delivery position. Now you can see that upper body moving back and that left shoulder going back. So that would be where you will be able to see this parametric acceleration, which is basically the upper body moving backward as those arms are getting flung out and accelerated. That upper body moving back will cause the hand path to actually come in. So good question. Definitely very technical. Let me follow a little bit and bring you up to speed. So looking at Lexi, so she stops rotating and her distance must have a different source than completionist sequencing through the swing. So here's the tricky thing with sequencing is you can do sequencing in different movements. So as an example, the sequencing for doing a snatch, which is a movement that has absolutely no rotation to it, is pretty much the same as the sequencing and the timing of the golf swing. So she's sequencing her body probably pretty close to what Fred Couples is doing, but she's doing it in different kind of cardinal directions. So if I bring Lexi back up, we can explore her since that's where the questions are going right now. That's Brian Gay. There's Lexi Thompson. Okay, so if we were to kind of go through what's going on and how she's creating speed, you'll see that she's starting with that lower body, but it's not getting transferred through the core, because if it was getting transferred through the core in terms of rotation, we would see that her upper body would basically have a little bit of pull and rotation. You can see she's doing it more through her back, which she's going to continue later on. If it was through the abs, you would see that rib cage already starting to get out of the way and her chest would be a little bit more rotated towards the golf ball. What you'll see next is as she's basically standing up, which helps shallow out the club, now is when she's rotating, not as a way of creating a whole lot of speed, but more in a way of controlling the path. Because at this point, the effect the upper body is going to have on rotating is going to be minimal in terms of how much speed it's going to create. The time when if you look at the 3D graphs, the time when the body is producing the greatest amount of speed is almost done by this point in the swing, and then you're essentially going to use those arms to more slingshot that speed that you've created. This is not the time for the body to be producing speed. Yeah, I completely agree. She's definitely a jump staller, and that's one of the ways that she uses her body to help control the path. It's got some great speed potential. It's got some big limitations as far as I'm concerned in terms of flat spot and path reliability. But when she's playing well, she hits the ball great. I completely agree. So there's a comment of basically the T drill. She would have a lot of trouble with the T drill, and that might be one, if I ever had the chance to work with her, that I would probably start with, because it would show pretty clearly how she's controlling the path, and it would force her to get a little bit more activity with her trunk, which if I was working with her as a coach, I would probably be doing more in the gym and less on the range. But that jump stall, it's important to understand that jump stall pattern, that stall does stuff to the path and the face that are important. And if you're going to take that away, you have to give her a better way to do it. And right now, I think that's the best way that she can figure out how to do it. All right, so I have another question. Players with limited mobility in the hips pelvis may have trouble getting into that halfway down position, or is it just a matter of flexibility, going to a trainer and doing stretch programs, or are there drills that can help with that? So that delivery position that I talk about, let's pull up a couple of these students who are, I like to call them my champions students as opposed to senior, but in terms of flexibility and stability, that's not their strengths. So flexibility, what'll happen is you'll see that the upper body and the pelvis during that first movement are basically going to be moving more or less together. The lowest I've ever seen in terms of rib cage mobility from a physical test was 10 degrees. So I had a tour pro who had 10 degrees of thoracic rotation bilaterally. So basically, if I pinned his shoulder blades, he was only able to turn his rib cage 10 degrees to the left and 10 degrees to the right. But he was able to get into a good delivery position. He just wasn't able to have as much displacement between the pelvis and the trunk. So what'll happen with the 10 degrees is not a lot. I think most people are going to have that. What typically happens is when they're trying to get into this delivery position, they will tend to feel weak and they'll tend to not believe that they can hit the ball as far from there as they could with those arms pushing on the club earlier, because it tends to feel very weak. So one of the things that we'll do with as far as drills that work on that, we'll work on getting them connected with their abs to their hips and their hips to the ground. So whether it's the push-pull or whether it's the trail leg push, whether it's kind of a resisted merry-go-round, there are things we'll do to try to get the core muscles to feel active, because then you'll tend to feel that that's at least somewhat powerful. And then what we can, the big thing is, if you have a hard time getting into this delivery position, which I think most people can physically get into in some way, shape, or form, but if you have a hard time mentally getting into this delivery position, it's going to be hard to have that positive angle of attack. Because if you think about it, let me bring up, where is he? Dustin Johnson, just so you can, I mean, that's an iron. So let me bring up Gary Woodland, and you'll see why that's so critical. If you can't get into that delivery position, you're going to have a hard time creating enough side bend. So he gets into that delivery position kind of right about there, and then uses the trunk to get his arms down. So when I look at the sequencing of it, basically look at when the right arm is leaving the body, or when that right arm is starting to extend. Whoops, I'll do that a little slower. So to my eye, it looks like that right arm is, on 3D, it would be just slightly starting to extend right about here. That's one of the difference between the driver and the iron swing. But you'll see that he's kind of really extending that arm late through the ball. If you have a hard time getting into this delivery position, you'll never have that amount of side bend, which is where the positive angle of attack is going to come from. I started in the fitness world, so I definitely think that doing exercises can help speed up this whole process, but I've also tested enough really good ball strikers to know that for the most part, I'm not going to put a big kind of red X on mobility and stability, that they're not able to make a good golf swing. I think that you can, to follow up on that question, I think that would be more of a limitation in terms of creating a lot of club head speed than it would be to maximizing your current club head speed and getting enough, as much ball speed as you can. So that's where, if I have a player who's kind of maxed out their technique, then we're definitely talking fitness to see how much we can improve their club head speed. But just from a blanket statement, I think most people are not getting as much out of their club head speed as they could. So good. We definitely touched on some of Lexi's unique moves, but you can see how she kind of fits the pattern of someone who creates a fair amount of speed. We looked at some other different case studies to see how this sequencing plays a big part. Are there any last questions? Because we're approaching kind of the end of the timeline that we have for today. As I said at the beginning, I'm hoping to do more of these, and if you have any suggestions on topics that you would like to see, please either put them in the chat or email us directly. I have a bunch of ideas, but it's always great to provide what you're actually looking for. So if there are no more questions, I'll bring back Jim and he can kind of wrap this up. I really appreciate all of you sitting in on this, and hopefully it helps you feel a little bit more clear as to how tour pros hit the ball as far as they do, and hopefully it gives you a few ideas for what you could be doing with your game if distance is one of your main concerns.
Hey everyone, it's Jim here. Thank you, Tyler, for that. That was pretty awesome. Thank you everyone for staying around and hanging with us for that. Now, if you're not a member, you can join Golf Smart Academy. And if you're more interested in distance or power, there's actually power plans, driver plans. There's a whole bunch of plans actually that has your whole game covered. And as I'm sure another Golf Smart Academy member can tell you how beneficial the site is. If you want to join and give it a shot, go right ahead. You have a 30-day risk-free guarantee, which means you can try it out for 30 days, and if you don't like it, you can refund it. But not many people do. As you can see, Tyler is very scientific and proven. It's not a bunch of vague generalities, which is the reason why I went to him. My golf game kind of became a bunch of Band-Aids, from just swing stuff to even playing on the course. And Tyler was the one to kind of break down the science for me and get me hitting better. And I know there's a lot of great success stories, and so if you want to join, just go to golfsmartacademy.com. Now, if you want for more webinars, you can shoot me an email, Jim@GolfSmartAcademy. We're trying to get any ideas or more ideas you guys have, whether it be power or short game or course strategy, putting, chipping, anything you guys want, let us know. And whatever is the most popular, we'll do our best to cover it in a webinar. And that's really about all I got for tonight. And again, I hope to see you soon. And again, you can email me at jim@golfsmartacademy.com. I'll probably follow up with you guys tomorrow with an email. And I think we should have a replay of the webinar pretty soon. So when I get my hands on that, I'll make sure I'll get it over to you guys. And other than that, I'm all set. So thank you so much, guys. Have a great night, and great golfing to you in the future.